There's a strange thing about history. It loves circles. A boy born in a tent in the Libyan desert ends up dying just a few dozen meters from another patch of sand, bleeding into the ground he once commanded with absolute certainty. And, you know, people still argue whether it was destiny or just the weight of decades catching up with him. But let's rewind. Not too far, just enough to understand why the world watched the events of October 20th, 2011 with such a mix of disbelief, grim satisfaction, and for some, even quiet sorrow. The fall of Muammar Gaddafi wasn't just the end of a leader. It was the collapse of a long, chaotic orbit around one man's ego, ambition, paranoia. Call it whatever you prefer. He stepped into power in 1969, and Libya didn't simply change. It was reshaped, twisted, redefined. And his final moments, well, they weren't the kind granted to kings or presidents. They were raw, messy, and filmed on shaky phones by men screaming with rage. Let's walk through the story, slowly sometimes, quicker at other points, just like the rhythm of a nation that lived under him for more than 4 decades. The rise, from desert winds to a military coup. Gaddafi's beginnings were so humble that even he liked to exaggerate them later. Born in a tent, raised in a family that had more stories than money, he somehow carried a sense of destiny from an early age. His teachers noticed he wasn't just clever, he was restless, maybe even a bit stubborn. The kind of young man who reads political theory and thinks, why not me? Why not now? At university, he became something of a political spark plug. Not dangerous yet, but definitely buzzing. When he graduated from the Libyan Military Academy in 1965, he carried with him more than a diploma. He carried blueprints, rough, dangerous ones, for overthrowing the monarchy of King Idris I. By September 1st, 1969, those blueprints turned real. A swift military coup, clean enough to feel almost surreal, swept Gaddafi into power. Suddenly, he wasn't just a promising officer. He was the new commander-in-chief and head of the Revolutionary Command Council, the body that would shape Libya in ways nobody could fully predict. And almost instantly, he began cutting old ties. The U.S. military bases? Gone. Foreign petroleum assets? Nationalized. Alcohol and gambling? Forbidden. Negotiation with Israel? Off the table entirely, almost reflexively. He wanted a new Libya. But mostly, let's be honest, he wanted a Libya that reflected him. The 1970s and 1980s. Oil, power, and fire. Gaddafi didn't simply govern. He pushed, pulled, and sometimes broke things just to see how they'd fall. Libya became loud, diplomatically loud, which often meant isolated. A cult of personality swelled around him, partly constructed by propaganda, partly by his own magnetic, unpredictable presence. His government funded revolutionary groups abroad, from the IRA in Northern Ireland to various militant factions across Africa. Libyan agents hunted dissidents on foreign soil. And Gaddafi himself? He grew more erratic, more theatrical, more convinced that his vision was the only one that mattered. Inevitably, this brought him into conflict with the United States. In April 1986, American warplanes launched from British bases bombed key locations in Libya. The operation killed and wounded members of Gaddafi's own family. The intended target, Gaddafi himself, slipped away, but the message was unmistakable. Add to that the accusations surrounding the Lockerbie bombing, where 270 people died when a civilian plane exploded over Scotland. Libya was blamed, sanctioned, boxed in by the international community. Still, Gaddafi didn't bend easily. Or at all. A new century, a man trying to rebrand. As the 2000s rolled in, Gaddafi suddenly began softening his edges, or pretending to. Libya announced plans to abandon unconventional weapons programs. Sanctions loosened. Western diplomats shook his hand, some with more enthusiasm than others. And in February 2009, he became chairman of the African Union. Quite a facelift for a man with a reputation that could fill entire textbooks. But history has a short fuse sometimes. In February 2011, The protests that toppled leaders in Tunisia and Egypt swept into Libya like a brush fire. Anti-Gaddafi demonstrations exploded in Benghazi, spreading faster than the regime could contain them. Instead of dialogue, the government chose fire, literally. Fighter jets, helicopter gunships, live ammunition. That was the moment the world realized. Gaddafi hadn't changed, not really. Not ever. Ministers defected. Pressure mounted. Foreign governments condemned him. And yet he appeared on television on February 22nd, shouting that he would not step down, calling protesters traitors, insisting that he remained beloved. But behind the scenes, his power was crumbling. The world steps in, sanctions, airstrikes, and a tightening noose. By late February, rebels controlled large swaths of territory. Tripoli felt cornered. Gaddafi blamed al-Qaeda, bizarrely, almost desperately. The UN imposed a travel ban. An arms embargo froze the family's assets. Then came March 17, 2011, when the UN Security Council voted for military action to protect civilians. NATO launched airstrikes that tore into Gaddafi's forces, plunging the conflict into a brutal stalemate. More defections, more chaos. On April 30th, a NATO strike killed his youngest son and 3 grandchildren. Gaddafi himself survived yet again, hiding, moving, listening to the world closing in on him. Arrest warrants followed soon after, targeting him, his son, and his intelligence chief. Most charges revolved around crimes against civilians. And then, August 2011, Tripoli fell. Rebel forces stormed his headquarters, looting and smashing symbols of his rule. Yet Gaddafi himself was nowhere to be found. Rumors said he was hiding in Sirte or trapped, depending on how you viewed it. But fleeing? Never. He would rather die than run. He almost got his wish. The last flight, a convoy, NATO missiles, and a drainage pipe. At 8:30 a.m. on October 20th, 2011, with Sirte collapsing around him, Gaddafi attempted to escape in a convoy of 75 vehicles. A bold, reckless move, and one that didn't stay hidden for long. A call he made was intercepted. NATO spotted the convoy. A U.S. Predator drone fired first. French fighter jets followed with devastating precision, tearing through the vehicles. Loyalists died in clusters. The convoy split, dissolving into chaos. NATO later insisted they didn't know Gaddafi was inside. Maybe that's true. Maybe not. History tends to blur those corners. After the airstrike destroyed the vehicle ahead of him, Gaddafi, wounded, crawled into a nearby house with his son Mutassim. But the shelter didn't last. Shells struck the building. Mutassim and about 20 fighters attempted to look for surviving vehicles, belly crawling towards Sandberm. Somewhere in the chaos, a guard threw a grenade that bounced off a wall and detonated near Gaddafi. 2 died. He was wounded by fragments, his flak jacket shredded. Realizing there was nowhere left to go, the former dictator hid in a large drainage pipe. A symbol so simple it would become iconic. Then rebel fighters found them. A burst of gunfire wounded him in the leg and back. Some rumors claimed one of his own men shot him to spare him a worse fate. Hard to know for sure. Too many men, too much dust, too much rage in the air. But what is certain is that Gaddafi was dragged out, slowly, painfully, into a circle of fighters who had no intention of giving him a clean death. The capture, no mercy, no pause. A UN report later added more layers, claiming Gaddafi was initially injured by grenade shrapnel and was dazed, bleeding, barely conscious. One of his men surrendered. Gaddafi lay on the ground, confused, probably for the first time in decades, unsure what would happen next. Some reports say he whispered, "Please don't shoot." Others deny it. He did say things, captured on shaky videos. "God forbids this, and do you know right from wrong?" Strange words for a man whose regime imprisoned, tortured, and killed opponents for decades. Rebel fighters shouted, some furious, some euphoric, some filming. When they tried to force him up, his legs failed him. He collapsed more than once. And then the beating began. Punches, kicks, shoving, insults. Someone stabbed him with a bayonet. In the backside, of all places, a symbolic strike meant to humiliate more than kill. Gunfire erupted. Some shot into the air. Some didn't. He was loaded onto a truck, slumped, bleeding heavily. Some fighters claimed later the vehicle got caught in crossfire, that a bullet struck his head. Others said plainly, "We killed him." Truth doesn't really survive moments like that. Only impressions do. Aftermath. A dictator on display. By the time Gaddafi reached the ambulance, his body was lifeless. Doctors later said he had gunshot wounds to the head and abdomen. Forensic notes showed residue consistent with close-range fire. His corpse, bruised, bloodied, broken, was stripped and exposed. Crowds gathered, some celebrating, some simply watching in stunned silence. People snapped photos. Some touched the body like it was a relic. Others cursed at it. Then came the public display. His remains were placed inside a large freezer in Misrata, a makeshift morgue visited by thousands. Long lines formed as people waited to see, with their own eyes, that the man who ruled them since 1969 was truly dead. Next to him lay the body of his son. Eventually, the corpses were given to family members. They buried them in a secret location somewhere in the desert. Ironically, the same kind of landscape where his story began. The echoes, rage, revenge, and the shadow of a fallen regime. His death didn't bring unity, not even close. Some of those involved in capturing him were later tortured by loyalists seeking revenge. Libya splintered further. The vacuum left behind became a battlefield of militias, foreign interests, and old grudges. Gaddafi's rule was ruthless, yes, but predictable in its own way. Without him, Libya became something else entirely. Unstable, fractured, a place where the ghosts of his decisions still linger. And maybe that's the unsettling part. A dictator dies, but his legacy, the fear, the loyalty, the fractures, doesn't just vanish. It seeps into everything. A final thought. Gaddafi rose from almost nothing. He built a persona larger than life, larger than Libya, perhaps larger than reality. And his end, well, it came not with ceremony or justice, but with chaos, vengeance, and the cold lens of 100 cell phones. The question is, and it's not an easy one, was this the only ending a man like him could ever have had? Or was the brutality of his death a reflection of something deeper inside the nation he shaped?